Welcome to the fourth breakdown video of my Mardini submissions. This one will be a bit longer and more detailed as we will dive into the grooming world and look at how to simulate hair with vellum. In the course of the video I will show you little tips that help me, and at the end we will look at rendering in Solaris and Karma. I will make the whole file available for free on Gumroad. The chicken model is also included as a download link from Chewbone. Let's look at the setup. I have divided the head and the body into two parts, so I can create different hair types. The right and the left stream are quite identical, and it's just a copy and not really a big or complicated setup. Let's start with the character animation. Here I started with the free Chewbone animal pack, and I used the Hen model. And if you download the pack and want to use the same model, you can select the SK Hen FBX. It's like T-pose. And for the animation, I use the Walk FBX from the same animal pack. On the model itself, I do a subdivision to create a more high-res mesh, create some normals. Here on the FBX animation import, I convert my skeleton into a motion clip. So you see the whole animation as individual skeletons on each frame. To loop the animation, because the original is just a few frames long and then it stops, I use the motion clip cycle to create cycles, and I just do 24 after the original. To convert it back to a skeleton, you need the motion clip evaluate. So you convert all the single skeletons on each frame back to one animation skeleton. You see, it loops perfectly fine. Here I use a skeleton blend. If you work with hair or fur and do simulations, I recommend using an A pose or T pose or another neutral position or pose of the character, so you can easily create your hair on a perfect mesh. Because if you do simulation, you don't want any intersection of the guides. And if you have just a walking animation here, and let's have a look here. Let's say you have this model here and you want to create some guides and do simulation, and you create some hairs here. You can't mirror your guides to the other side, and they maybe intersect with the body itself. And if you have a pose, it's easier to create your guides along the skin, and it's easier to mirror your guides from one side to the other. It's not a problem if you work procedurally, but if you use some brushes to create your guides manually, it's easier to mirror it with a perfect A pose or T pose. And I usually do just 24 frames here with a keyframe, so it blends between the start pose. It takes 24 frames to get into the walk cycle. And at the end, I just use a time shift node to shift the time range by 24 frames. So it starts not in the A pose, but it starts in the walk animation start position. Then I use a point velocity to create the velocity vectors to later use it as a motion blur in my render. That is the whole model preparation and animation. It's nothing fancy, just an easy skeleton blend, and I import extra animation FBX. Super simple, super easy. Let's begin with the body hair. Here I use an attribute paint to create a mask where I want my guides to be. Then a hair generation node to create the actual guides. Here you can change your length and your segments and your total count. If you work with hair and do deformation and simulation, I recommend just create a rest attribute at the beginning, and don't forget it because it can cause a lot of errors and problems along the way. Then I randomize my length of the hair and use a guide initialize to orient or rotate my hair along an axis. Here it's called wind direction. You can change the amount of the wind and your flow along the skin. Then I resample it. So here you get your guides, your skin, and your VDB. I don't have any VDB, so you can leave that empty. And you can do whatever you want along the stream when you work with viewer. So here a resample works just fine. Then I use a hair clump to create some curls. I will show a trick later to break up the curls so you don't have uh, identical curves on the whole guides, but here it doesn't really matter. So I just went for one hair clump node and set my curves here. Then again, I use a resample to make less points on the guides for the simulation so it's faster. I create a name attribute, a point group to specify and select the whole points here, and then a group by range to specify the area on the guides where I want some constraints in the Vellum solver later. And here I change it to points and use 3 points, and start is from the root, so it's from the skin to the end of the guides, but I just use 3 points. And if you disable this, you only get one guide here, and if you enable this, it selects all the guides. Really cool way to do this without a loop. On the head, I used an attribute paint again, attribute blur and a remap. Then I create my guides. And here I use Grumbeer to do some deformation and to change the length of my hair slightly. You could use guide groom, but if I already have some guides here, I get some errors. I'm not sure why. It takes a really long time to cook the node, and it's really buggy. So I just use Grumbeer for this one, and I hope SideFX will release a new update soon, so maybe this issue get fixed. Then again, a rest resample, and here I try to break up the hair. So I use a random selection. It's a labs node, and in here I use 50% to create a group. So 50% of the primitives is in a group and the rest not. And then I split them. So I just get the group here and the rest in this one. And here I use a hair clump to create some curls, and also for this one and this one. And here I just used it again to split it up again into 50-50. So you have even more variation in the curls. Then I merge it all together. And by the way, this object merge is just the skin here, because I don't want to connect them with wires. I just use the object merge. I merge them all together, and you see I have different curls. Then I use a hair clump again to break it up, and Chris guide process up to break it up even further. Resample, named it group, and here again point group, point range group to specify the constraints later in the Vellum setup. Then I merge both together, so I have one big hair thing. Group arrange to pin the root point. There I bring in the collision. The collision is the hen walk animation from the T-pose to the walk animation or pose. Vellum hair constraint setup. Then Vellum attached to geometry to pin my hairs onto the body with the pin group here. And now we start creating the constraints. Here I use the body con group, which we created before here with the 3 points. And this creates random constraints between all the points from the root to 3 points up. And you can specify the amount of points and the amount of constraints per point, and the more you have, the more stable they are. And yeah, and you can also specify the stretch stiffness and just play around with it. Then the same for the head, and again for the head, but here I just do for the full hair on the head and not just a group, so they are even more stable. In the Vellum solver, I just use 2 substeps. Normally, I recommend doing 4 or even 6 to have the real behavior of your guides during the simulation. If you just use 1 substep, they stretch a lot and it looks weird and it's not the look you want. So I recommend at least 4 normally. In the Vellum solver, I use a pop wind to break up the motion a little and just to add some noise. That's the whole simulation setup. And you see with the constraints on the head hair, they keep the volume, but they're still moving at the end of the hair on the tips, but they just keep the look and the shape. Let's jump into the hair generation. Here I split it up again into 2 parts, body hair and the head hair. Here I bring in my model, my walk model. I use a time shift to make a static frame and at a rest position, so it doesn't move and it doesn't move and has an rest attribute. And here it's the same, but just a walk animation again. And in the hair generation, I use guides. I disabled this before, but here you can use this to create the hairs based on the guides. And here you have to disable grow unguided hair. Otherwise, you maybe get some weird hairs where there are no guides. So I always disable this when I have guides and just want hairs on the guides. And you see you get some nice hairs around the guides. You can specify the influence radius. The bigger you get, the more the shape changes. I usually do a really small one if I have enough guides before. And here in the attribute and appearance, you can change your thickness. And you can also do this by or based on a mask, but I just went for this value here. Then a hair clump, just create some more curls and some clumps to break up the shape. A guide frizz sub to break it up even further. And to get some single hair around the body so it looks more non-uniform and realistic, I use a random selection again. Show you, it's really hard to see. I select like a little amount of the primitives of the hairs, and I use this group in here to make the small single hair around the body. So without the group, it looks like this, and with the group, you get like just a small amount of hair standing out. Then I resample to create a smooth curve here. The same setup for the head. I bring in the animation, use a time shift and a rest to make a static pose. And here I bring in the animation again. Then in the hair gen, I create my hairs with the same setup and the same settings. Hair clump, guide freeze. So here I actually use the guide freeze to create a bigger volume, because if you look at this, it there looks so thin and not quite good. And with the freeze, it creates more volume, especially on the more on the skin side, so they look thicker, closer to the root. And you can use a curve mask, and you can drive this wherever you want. Then again, random selection to break the hair. And again, a freeze up, resample, And I create a group called mid to specify the middle guides for later. I want to shade them differently. And a group to color the group because I will color the hair red in the middle. Then I combine them and I create a null. The table is just a simple tube using V unwrap to create the UVs on top here, an UV texture to create the UVs around with the cylindrical texture type here, poly bevel, and a transformation to do the rotation, and point velocity to create the velocity vectors here. Then for the seeds and for the corn things here, I created a circle. I set my normals to the position. So well, you see they point outwards here. So if you do a mountain, it's just a flat noise here. Resample, scattered some points. Use mobs randomize for the orientation. Then attribute adjust float for the p-scale and random selection to delete some of the points. The model, the corn and seed model itself is just a sphere, match size, color, and UV unwrap. Then I copied them to the points, and you have some super simple line here. And again, the same transform, node, and point velocity. So it looks like this if you are chicken walking. Then for the particles, I create a box, use ISO offset to create a volume, scattered some points, use a pop network with a pop wind and a pop axis force, and a pop drag so it's slower. If you do the simulation, they just move slightly. Then I use a time shift to offset it by 48 frames, so they just don't start, but they are already in the middle of the movement. And then attribute adjust flow to create random p-scale. That's the whole setup. Let's jump into Solaris and see how I did the rendering and the lighting. Here in Solaris, I bring all my objects in with a stop import. I bring in my chicken, the viewer, the walking circle table here, my dust, and corn. You won't see this here, but I just imported them, merge them. Then I create a material library and a material link to apply my materials. For the wood texture, I use Grayscale Gorilla wood textures, and the viewer is just a Karma viewer material. And in subs, I created a group and a color attribute for the hair. And in here, I bring this in with the display color, and I use a color ramp to color the hair group here. The body hairs are also just a Karma viewer with a slightly melanin, and you can play around with this and change the colors and the roughness values and do whatever you want. Here I import my camera from the OBJ level. If you look at this, I have a basic camera animation here in the OBJ level, and I can bring this easily with a camera scene import into Solaris. And if you want to change the focal length or the f-stop or focus distance, you can use a camera edit. Just drag and drop your camera in here in the primitive tab, and you can change everything you want and do a transformation or change your f-stop, merge it, and also the lights. I just have a dome light and an area light. Let's have a look. And this is actually the whole setup and rendering part. You see it's not complicated and quite easy and fast to build. You can just copy the same hair setup for all your hair creation and simulation because it's very often the same. You create your guides, Then you create some range groups to specify where you want the constraints. Then you do the simulation, and then you create more detailed small hairs. So you copy and create hairs around the guides you used for the simulation. Thanks for watching, and I hope you like it. See you on the next one.